thanks. So I'm actually gonna frame this problem in the context in which I've worked during my career, which is the question of the relationship of craftsmanship and architecture. Back in September of 2006, were you one of Scott Marble's students? Yeah. We had a symposium at Yale that explored the changing nature of the design process as it is being remediated by digital tools. And one of the topics that we explored in some detail was this question of craft. And Scott Marble, who's on the faculty at Columbia, gave a really interesting talk where he introduced this concept of the relationship of craft to risk, and that craftsmanship was really about the willingness to take a certain kind of risk. In that talk, Scott defined craft as skills developed over time in direct relationship to the working of materials. The argument that I want to try to make here briefly today is that if that is in fact the definition of craft, including this concept of risk, that architects as design professionals really haven't been craftspeople probably since the age of the Gothic cathedral, in fact. But digital tools are now beginning to reinsert the concept of craft back into the process. And so this is a picture that we took when we visited Rick and Erwin Hauer's studio of one of the projects that's out in the gallery here. It's one of Professor Hauer's continuum. And in my view, this kind of work, this exploration of a set of both theoretical and geometric and executional ideas is really at the heart of what craft is. But I want to say, particularly as someone who practiced architecture for a very long time, the concept of craft as separated from skill or professional competency has really until only very recently been almost completely separated from the practice of architecture. The way, I'm trying to forward the slides on my computer. The way I describe that to my students is with a diagram that my architectural colleagues on this panel have seen numerous times. This is a diagram of a traditional architectural project. The A circle on the left is the architect, the blue circle on the right is the contractor, and the green bubble at the top is the client. And in this diagram, which is the way most architectural projects are organized, architects come up with ideas which they draw in very abstract form, and then they dare contractors to build them from the drawings that they create. So there's a real separation in that process between thinking about design intent, which happens on the left-hand side of the diagram, and executing or making designs which happen by the contractors on the right-hand side of the diagram. And that construct has separated architecture as a discipline from the concept of craft, and particularly craft that involves the risk of this accumulated skill and a kind of preordained outcome. In fact, my argument here would be that what's now beginning to happen is that, and I think that Zoe's argument validates this to a certain extent, that craft is now beginning to become reinserted into the design process, including the architectural design process, in both the ideation of design concepts, in other words, how you conceive them and how you use digital tools to ideate, and in terms of the execution, in terms of how that information gets transferred through the supply chain to actual production. Architects traditionally in Western delivery constructs have had no responsibility for the means of production. They're separated contractually from what's called the means and methods of production. And now I think what you're starting to see as part of a general trend that's happening across the building industry, that separation is actually starting to collapse in on itself. You know, my colleagues from shop here are great advocates of this process. Another firm in Philadelphia called Kieran Timberlake also does a lot of work on this. And Kieran and Timberlake wrote a book recently called Refabricating Architecture, which talked about the ideas of using, reincorporating, understanding the means of production in the design process. And in that book, they wrote the following quote. They said, "Architects are no longer limited to the fragmentary representation of physical ideas. We can now fully preform them," meaning that digital technologies are now allowing architects to preconceive design notions before they dare the contractors to actually construct them. But I would actually take a minor exception to that argument in the sense that if you have the obligation to preform an idea, you must also take on the obligation to understand how that idea is manifest, and that's the risk. That's the new risk that's actually introduced into the equation. Those of you who are architects, either up here on this panel or in the audience, realize that's a non-trivial problem we're introducing that risk. So here's a little science experiment that we're doing right now. This is a design of a digitally fabricated ceiling system that we were having put into our office in Waltham, Massachusetts. We wanted an architectural idea that represented some of the things that we as a company were interested in. And this is how the design architects are trying to translate this idea to the fabricator, who, by the way, quit yesterday. So if anybody knows a good digital fabricator, I'll leave you my business card. But you can see here, these are pretty traditional architectural, what we call instruments of service. They're diagrammatic, they're intentional, they don't have a lot of, they're not struggling a lot with the means of how this thing actually might come together, except these guys actually really are. I mean, they're starting to produce, collateral material in the exploration and design, unlike anything that has been produced by this firm before, as they try to figure out these individual pieces, figure out how they hang together, interact with the contractor, and the risk proposition is not just, how do I get this idea manifest, it's also manifest in the context of, I'm speaking as the client, I have a budget, I have a schedule, I can't have this thing falling down on people's heads and killing them, you know, those kinds of questions. And so my argument here is that the concept of craft, connected to the concept of risk, is now recreated by the presence of these mediating digital technologies in the design process. That it actually reconnects the proposition and this original idea that architects have always worked under, which is this concept of design intent. I'll come up with a vaguely held notion and I'll dare a contractor to build it, is actually now starting to go away. So there's actually a new concept of risk contemplated in that environment. Now what's also happening in my view is that